The man on the platform called her name, but it was not her name. He called her the asset. Alara stood beside the dusty wagon, the one that was hers and no longer hers, and felt the words settle over her like a shroud. An asset, a thing to be tallied, valued, and disposed of. The broker, a pinch-faced man named Finch, pointed a fleshy finger at her. Sturdy, he announced to the gathered crowd in the town square. Strong-backed and hale, accustomed to hard work. His voice was the sound of coins being counted. It stripped the meat from her bones and left only a calculation. Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Not cruel, not yet. Just the idle amusement of people with nothing better to do on a Tuesday. They looked at her wide hips, her broad shoulders, the plain, sun-weathered set of her face, and they saw exactly what Finch was selling. A workhorse, a piece of inventory left over from a failed venture. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 2 months. He had left behind a mountain of debt and a single pregnant widow. The asset. This moment, this public appraisal was the final invoice. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever been judged by your cover instead of by the contents of your soul, then subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. I want to tell you about Alara. A hot, white spike of rage shot through the numbness that had encased her heart for weeks. It was a feeling so sharp and clean it felt like life itself. She took a step forward. The dust puffed around her heavy boots. "My name," she said, her voice low and rough from disuse, "is Alara." Finch's smile tightened. He was not accustomed to assets that spoke. "As I said," he continued, raising his voice to speak over her, "an honest bargain for any man needing a reliable hand around the homestead. She can cook, clean, and mend. And she is compliant." The word was a lie. He knew it. She knew it. And in that moment she decided the whole town would know it, too. "I am not for sale," she said, louder this time. The words echoed in the sudden quiet of the square. The laughter died. Now the faces turned to her with a different kind of interest. The interest of a crowd sensing a fight. Finch's face mottled with red. "Your husband's debts are being settled. This is the settlement." "My husband is dead," Alara stated, the fact a cold, hard stone in her mouth. "His debts are his. I am not a chair. I am not a plow. You will not sell me." She could feel the weight of her unborn child, a secret anchor in the storm of her body. They did not know. If they knew, they would have added it to the ledger. Breeding stock. The humiliation was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels, how many places hold women who have been told they are worth less than they are. Finch sputtered, but a voice from the back of the crowd cut him off. A man stepped forward. He was not tall, but he was built of solid, immovable lines. Weathered face, dust-caked hat, eyes the color of a winter sky. He moved without hurry, his gaze sweeping over Finch, then the wagon, and finally her. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her not like the others did, not with pity or amusement or appraisal. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending. He was assessing the problem. After her public defiance, after the burning shame, Alara slipped away. She found the narrow alley between the mercantile and the smithy. The air was thick with the smell of coal dust and discarded things. She leaned against the rough brick wall, the sharp edges digging into her back, and the fight drained out of her. It left a hollow space, and into that space rushed all the grief she had been holding back for 2 months. The tears came, not a gentle weeping, but a raw, silent cascade that shook her entire body. It was a release of years. Years of being Thomas's quiet, plain wife. Years of being overlooked, of being useful but never cherished. Years of believing her worth was tied to the man she served. He was gone, and now she was nothing but a debt on a ledger. When the storm of grief passed, it left a cold, hard clarity in its wake. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her knuckles scraped and raw. She looked at her hands. They were large, capable. They had planted gardens and stitched wounds and fixed harnesses. They were not the hands of an asset. They were the hands of a survivor. In the quiet of that foul-smelling alley, she made a vow, a solemn promise whispered to the indifferent bricks. Never again. Never again would she allow her life to be in the hands of another. Never again would she trust a man's promises. Never again would she be property. Her survival would be her own work, her future her own forging. She would be beholden to no one. She had nothing, a worn dress, the child in her womb, and this vow. It would have to be enough. She pushed herself off the wall, her spine straight. The hollow space inside her was not empty anymore. It was filled with a cold, dense resolve. She stepped out of the alley, back into the unforgiving sunlight, expecting to face the world alone. But the world had other plans. The quiet man from the crowd was standing there, waiting. His horse was hitched to a sturdy wagon, much larger and better kept than her own. He was the one who had spoken to Finch. "The deal is concluded," the man had said, his voice a low rumble that cut through Finch's blustering. He had handed the broker a small, heavy purse, not with a flourish but with the simple finality of a gate being latched. Finch, clutching the purse, had tried one last time to poison the well. "She's got a temper on her, that one. You'll have your hands full, Caleb." The man, Caleb, had not even looked at him. His attention was on Alara. Now, as she emerged from the alley, he was still there. He simply watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He gestured with his head toward the passenger seat of his wagon. "Get in," he said. It was not a command. It was a statement of the next logical step. She stopped. The vow was still fresh, a raw wound in her soul. "I'm not going with you." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "Finch was going to sell your contract to the mining camp foreman." Alara's blood ran cold. The mining camp was a place of last resort, a brutal, lawless settlement where women were scarcer and more brutally used than clean water. It would have been a death sentence. "I bought your husband's debt," Caleb said, his gaze steady. "I did not buy you." She stared at him, searching his face for the trick, the lie. She found nothing but a deep, weary honesty. "Why?" "I don't hold with the selling of people," he said simply. He looked away, toward the distant mountains that ringed the valley. "It's not right." Suspicion was a bitter taste in her mouth. "What do you want from me?" "The books on my ranch are a mess. I need someone who can read and write and make sense of numbers. Finch said your husband taught you his ledgers." So it was still a transaction. Not for her body but for her mind. It was better. It was still a chain. "I'll pay you a wage," he continued, as if reading her thoughts. "Fair wage. You'll have your own room. The door has a lock. You can have the key. You are free to leave whenever you wish. Your debt is settled. You owe me nothing." Alara stood frozen. Every word he spoke ran contrary to a lifetime of experience. A lock, wages, the freedom to leave. These were not things offered to an asset. "I don't trust you," she said, the words stark. He met her eyes again. There was a flicker of something in them, not offense but understanding. Maybe even respect. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to get in the wagon. The alternative is this town square. You can stay or you can come." He turned and began unhitching his horse, his movements economical and sure. He was not waiting for her answer. He had made his offer. The choice was hers. She looked at the faces of the people still lingering, their curious, judging eyes. She looked at the wagon that had been her home, now owned by a stranger. She felt the tiny, persistent flutter of life inside her. Her vow had been to be beholden to no one. But survival required a roof. It required food. For now, this man was offering a path to both. A path with a locked door at the end of it. She walked to the wagon and, without a word, pulled herself up onto the high seat. Caleb finished with his horse and climbed up beside her. He did not speak. He just clucked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the town of her humiliation behind. They rode in silence for hours. The sun beat down, and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels was the only sound. Alara kept herself rigid, a wall of distrust between them. As the afternoon sun began to dip, he pulled the wagon over under the shade of a large cottonwood. He climbed down and came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle. He held it out to her. "Are you hungry?" The question was so simple, so direct. It was not an order to prepare food. It was an inquiry into her own state of being. She could not remember the last time anyone had asked her that. She nodded, unable to speak. He handed her the bundle. Inside was a loaf of dark bread, a chunk of hard cheese, and an apple. Simple, honest food. He then walked over to check on the horses, turning his back to her completely. He gave her privacy. He did not watch her eat. He did not comment on her appetite. He treated her hunger as a fact, not a failing. In the world that had always shamed her for her size, for her very presence, this small, profound act of non-judgment was a revelation. She ate slowly, deliberately, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the food did not taste of ash. Tasted of a cautious, fragile hope. Chug. The ranch was called Whispering Gables, but the name was a kindness the land no longer deserved. The two large barns that gave it the name stood strong, but they were weathered gray and leaned with exhaustion. Fences sagged. The yard was a cluttered mess of discarded tools and overgrown weeds. It was a place holding on by a thread, just like its owner. Caleb's house was no better. It was a man's house, lived in without a woman's touch for what looked like a generation. Dust lay thick on every surface. Dishes were piled in the sink. It was organized by neglect. He showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It was sparse. A bed, a small table, a single window looking out onto a struggling vegetable patch. But it was clean, and on the inside of the door was a simple iron lock. He held out a key. "This is yours." She took it. The cold metal was heavy in her palm. Felt more valuable than gold. "The ledgers are in the main room when you're ready," he said, and then he left her alone. Alara did not look at the ledgers. Not yet. She understood chaos. Her whole life had been a form of it, and she knew how to fight it. You started small. You started with what was in front of you. She opened her small bundle of belongings, which contained little more than a change of clothes and a sewing kit. She took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen. She began to clean. She did it without being asked, without seeking praise. It was her language. She heated water on the stove. She scrubbed the grime from the dishes. She scoured the countertops until the wood grain showed through. She swept the floors, clearing away layers of dust and dirt. With every methodical motion, she was imposing order on his world, and on her own. She was not a guest. She was not a prisoner. She was a person who worked. This she understood. The ranch hands, a handful of young, wary boys and one old, grizzled foreman, watched her from a distance. They saw her size, her plainness, and they kept their distance, their attitudes a faint echo of the town's judgment. Caleb did not comment on her work. But when she served supper that evening, a simple stew made from the overgrown vegetables in the patch and some salted meat she'd found, he ate 2 full bowls. When he was done, he pushed the bowl back and looked at her for a long moment. "Supper was good," he said. From another man, it would have been a pleasantry. From Caleb, it felt like a treaty being signed. A week passed. Alara established a rhythm. She managed the house in the mornings, bringing a quiet, steady order to the chaos. In the afternoons, she would sit on the porch and watch the ranch. She was an observer. She saw systems. She saw how the wind moved through the valley, where the sun hit hardest, how the cattle favored one pasture over another. She saw the deep, worrying cracks in the whole operation. The biggest crack was the water. The main irrigation channel that fed the lower pastures had slowed to a trickle. The grass there was turning brown and brittle. Caleb and his foreman, an old man named Silas with eyes that missed nothing, were down there every day with the young hands. They waded through the muddy water, searching for the blockage. They cleared fallen branches and silt dams, but nothing worked. The flow would improve for an hour, then dwindle again. Caleb's frustration was a tight, grim line around his mouth. Without that water, his best grazing land would be useless by summer's end. It was another step toward ruin. From the porch, Alara watched. She did not watch the men. She watched the water. She watched the land around it. She had walked the length of the channel 2 days before, her heavy boots sinking into the soft earth. She had felt something wrong, a subtle shift in the ground itself. That afternoon, Caleb came back to the house, covered in mud and defeat. Silas was with him. "It's no good," Caleb said to the foreman, not even seeing Alara on the porch. "It's blocked somewhere deep. We'll have to dig out the whole blasted channel." Silas grunted. "Take a month. Land will be bone dry by then." Alara stood up. Her heart hammered. This was not her place. Her expertise was in numbers and kitchens, not earth and water. But she knew she was right. "The blockage isn't in the channel," she said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. Caleb's face was a mask of exhaustion. Silas's was skeptical. "It's upstream," she continued, forcing herself to meet their gaze. "About a quarter-mile past the bend. The ground is soft there. The creek bed runs over a limestone shelf. I think a sinkhole has collapsed. It's diverting most of the water underground." Silence. Caleb stared at her. He was not looking at a cook or a housekeeper. He was looking at someone who saw the bones of his land. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice low. "My father was a dowser," she said. "He taught me how to read the land, how water moves under the surface. The willows near the bend are yellowing from the root. They're drowning. The water is pooling beneath them." Silas let out a short, sharp sound. It was not a laugh. It was a grunt of pure surprise. He looked from Alara to Caleb. Caleb did not question her further. He just nodded. "Show us." She led them not to the channel, but up the slight rise beside it. She took them to the spot she had marked, a place that looked like any other patch of scrubby ground. She stomped her foot. The earth gave a dull, hollow thud. One of the young hands, sent to fetch shovels, dug where she indicated. Less than 3 feet down, his shovel broke through into wet, running darkness. They had found it, the ranch's stolen water. That evening, after a long day of digging a bypass trench, Caleb found her on the porch again. He sat not beside her, but on the steps below, looking out at the now gurgling channel in the distance. For a long time he said nothing. The sounds of the evening settled around them. Then he turned his head and looked up at her. The weariness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a keen, searching light. "What else can you do?" he asked. The question hung in the air, vast and full of possibility. It was the first time in her life anyone had asked her that question with genuine curiosity, instead of as a prelude to a demand. "I can read," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I can do sums." Caleb nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow we look at the books." Chug. The ledgers were a history of failure written in neat, sloping script. Caleb's father had kept them, then Caleb himself. They smelled of dust and desperation. He laid them on the kitchen table, the one she had scrubbed clean. "I'm a rancher, not a bookkeeper," he admitted, a rare confession of weakness. "We've had bad luck. Dry seasons, sick cattle, low market prices. It's been one thing after another for 5 years." Alara opened the first book. Her fingers traced the columns of figures. This was a language she understood as well as she understood the land. Numbers did not lie. They told stories. For 3 days, she did not leave the house. She ate her meals at the table, surrounded by paper. She filled sheet after sheet with her own calculations, cross-referencing years of sales, purchases, and expenses. Caleb left her alone, but she could feel his quiet, anxious presence orbiting the house. The fate of Whispering Gables was laid bare on that table. On the 4th day, she found it. It was not bad luck. Bad luck was random. This was a pattern. It was subtle, a masterclass in slow bleeding. A few cents extra per pound on feed from a certain supplier. Cattle reported as lost to sickness that were just below the average loss rate. Never enough to raise alarm. A consistent, slight underpayment on sales brokered by one specific agent in the capital. Each incident was a pinprick, but thousands of pinpricks over 5 years could drain a ranch dry. And on every questionable transaction, as a supplier, a witness, or a broker, was a single recurring name: Marcus Thorne. "Thorne," Caleb said, his voice flat and dangerous. He stood across the table from her, his hands clenched into fists on the wood. "He was my father's friend. He holds the note on our largest loan. He's been robbing you for years," Elara said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She pushed a sheet of paper toward him. It was a simple chart showing the ranch's profits on years Thorne was involved in their business, and the 1 year he was not. The difference was a stark, undeniable chasm. Caleb stared at the paper. The betrayal was a physical blow. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles. "He advised me to sell the north pasture 2 years ago," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Said it was poor land, that the money would see us through the winter. The north pasture has the highest water table on the property," Elara said softly. "It's the best land you have." The sound Caleb made was a low, guttural growl of a trapped animal. As if summoned by the devil's own timing, a polished black buggy pulled into the yard the next morning. A man in a tailored city suit and gleaming boots stepped out. He was handsome, with a charming, easy smile that did not reach his cold eyes. It was Marcus Thorne. He strode toward the house as if he owned it. "Caleb, my friend," he called out, his voice booming with false warmth. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, Elara a step behind him in the shadows of the doorway. He did not return the smile. Thorne's eyes flickered past Caleb and landed on Elara. His smile widened, but it became something sharp and unpleasant. He assessed her in a single, dismissive glance, her plain dress, her large frame. "Well now," Thorne said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I see you've acquired some new assets since your father's passing." The word, asset, struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. It was the same word Finch had used. It was meant to remind her of her place. It was meant to put her back in the box of public shame. He was telling Caleb, "This is who you've allied yourself with, a piece of second-hand goods." Thorne extended a hand to Caleb, but his eyes stayed on Elara. Always a pleasure to see a struggling man find a little comfort. Caleb did not take the offered hand. He simply stood there, a wall of silent fury. The air on the porch crackled with tension. The battle for Whispering Gables had just begun, and Marcus Thorne had made his first critical mistake. He had underestimated his opponent. Vuge. Caleb's rage was a palpable thing. It radiated from him like heat from a forge. After Thorne left, his charming threats about the loan hanging in the air, Caleb paced the length of the porch. "I'll ride into town," he snarled. "I'll face him." "No," Elara said. She stepped out of the shadows, into the full light. "That's what he wants." Caleb stopped, turning to her. "He called you." "I know what he called me," she interrupted, her voice firm. "He said it to hurt you, to make you angry. An angry man makes mistakes. A man blinded by rage is easy to cheat." She had his full attention now. The fury in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a cold, calculating focus. He was listening. "He thinks I am a weakness," she continued. "A foolish woman you took in out of pity. We will let him think that. And while he is watching you, expecting you to challenge him to a fight you can't win, I will be fighting a war he doesn't even know has been declared." She gestured back toward the ledgers on the table. "He is a snake. You don't fight a snake by shouting at it. You find its nest. You find its eggs. You find every dirty little deal it has ever made, and you bring it all out into the light." She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "We gather the proof. We do it quietly. We don't let him know that we know. We let him think he's winning, right up until the moment the trap springs. The word hung in the air between them. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was a declaration. Her fight was now his fight. His home was now her cause. Caleb stared at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the steel in her spine. He saw the strategist who had emerged from the shell of the victim. He gave a single, sharp nod. He agreed. The alliance was forged. Thorn must have sensed the shift. The quiet on the ranch was not the quiet of defeat he expected. It was the quiet of preparation, and it made him nervous. His attacks became less subtle. The whispers started in town. Malicious rumors, spun from half-truths and outright lies. The fat widow, they said, had bewitched poor Caleb. She was a gold digger, worming her way into his ranch, taking advantage of his grief. Her pregnancy, now becoming noticeable, was cited as proof of her loose morals. The young hands on the ranch heard the rumors on their trips for supplies. They came back with their faces clouded, their trust in Alara shaken. They started watching her with suspicion again. Then the sabotage began. A small line shack in the far pasture burned to the ground one night. It was passed off as an accident, a stray spark. But Silas, the old foreman, found a half-empty can of oil in the brush nearby. A week later, a dozen calves sickened and died. The veterinarian called it a gut infection from bad water, but Alara, who had checked the springs herself, knew the water was clean. She suspected poison. Thorn was turning up the heat, trying to force Caleb's hand, to create a catastrophe that would push the ranch into foreclosure and into his waiting grasp. He used the local sheriff, a man clearly in his pocket, to make official inquiries that were nothing more than harassment. The pressure was immense. Caleb grew more silent, his face a grim mask, but he held to their plan. He trusted her. The psychological warfare, however, found its mark in Alara. She had built a fragile sense of belonging at Whispering Gables. The methodical work, the quiet respect from Caleb, the first impressed grunt from Silas. It had been like laying the foundation for a new life. Now the rumors tore at that foundation. They confirmed her deepest, most ingrained fear, that she was a burden, curse, that her very presence brought ruin. One afternoon, she was mending a shirt on the porch when she overheard two of the young hands talking behind the barn. "Ever since she got here, it's been one disaster after another," one said. "Thorn wouldn't be pushing so hard if it weren't for her," said the other. "The whole town's talking. Says she's bad luck." The words were not meant for her, but they struck her heart like arrows. They were right. Before she came, Caleb had been struggling. Now he was under siege. She was the cause. Her vow echoed in her mind. Never be a burden. That night she made a decision. She would leave. She would disappear, and Thorn's reason for attacking Caleb would disappear with her. It was the only way to save him. She packed her few belongings into the same small bundle she had arrived with. She wrote a short, simple note for Caleb, explaining that the debt was paid and she was moving on. She left the key to her room on the table beside it. As she stood in the doorway, her hand on the latch, ready to slip away into the darkness, a frantic shout came from the yard. "Fire! The main hay barn is on fire!" Alara's blood ran cold. She ran out onto the porch. The largest of the two gables was engulfed in flames, the orange light turning the night to a terrifying dawn. This was it, the final catastrophic blow. The winter hay, the lifeblood of the herd, was gone. Caleb ran past her, his face a mask of horror. Then he stopped. He saw the bundle in her hand. He saw the finality in her eyes. The roar of the fire was a monster behind them, but his voice cut through it, low and raw with a pain that had nothing to do with the flames. "You were leaving." It was not a question. "I bring you nothing but trouble," she cried, the words torn from her. "He's doing this because of me. If I'm gone, he will stop." Caleb grabbed her arm. His grip was not harsh, but it was unbreakable. He pulled her around to face him, his eyes boring into hers, reflecting the fire. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a fierce, desperate passion she had never heard. "He's not doing this because of you. He's doing this because he's afraid of you. He was bleeding this ranch dry for years before you came. You are the only one who was ever smart enough to see it." He gestured wildly at the burning barn. "This isn't about you being a weakness. This is about him trying to get rid of my greatest strength. Don't you see? He wants you gone because if you stay, he loses." He let go of her arm, his shoulders slumping for a moment in the face of the disaster. "The men, they talk. I've heard them. I've set them straight. I told them you're the reason we still have a ranch to save." Another shout came from the fire. "Jimmy's trapped inside." The loft ladder collapsed. Caleb's head snapped up. Jimmy was the youngest of the hands, barely a boy. Without a second of hesitation, Caleb's focus shifted. The ranch, the money, the fight with Thorn, it all vanished. There was only the life that needed saving. He looked back at Alara one last time. His eyes were not pleading. They were stating a fact. "Don't you dare run," he said. And then he ran into the inferno. Ja! The fire was a living beast, roaring and consuming the heart of the ranch. Timbers groaned and snapped. The heat was a physical blow. Alara watched, frozen for a heartbeat, as Caleb disappeared into the blazing maw of the barn. Inside, there were two lives at stake. Jimmy, the young hand, and King, the ranch's prize breeding bull. The bull represented the future of the herd, an investment worth more than the barn itself. Losing him would be financial ruin. Silas, his face grim and streaked with soot, yelled at Caleb's retreating back. "The bull, Caleb! Get the bull!" But Caleb did not waver. He ignored the pen holding the terrified, bellowing animal and scrambled up a pile of fallen hay toward the collapsed loft where Jimmy had been last seen. He chose the boy. In that single, unhesitating act, Alara saw the true measure of the man. Marcus Thorne saw people as assets. Caleb saw them as people. The choice solidified everything. Her doubt vanished, burned away by the fire. This was not just Caleb's fight anymore. It was hers. She would not let this good man be destroyed. Caleb emerged moments later, half carrying a coughing, soot-covered Jimmy. Just as they cleared the doorway, the main roof of the barn gave way with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the night sky. The bull and the future he represented was gone. The fire was Thorne's masterstroke. With the winter feed gone and the ranch's most valuable animal dead, Caleb was financially shattered. It was the opening Thorne had been waiting for. He didn't come for the loan. He was more clever than that. He used the disaster to petition the county water board for an emergency reallocation of water rights, citing Whispering Gables' imminent failure and its inability to properly utilize its allotment. It was a legal garrote, designed to strangle the ranch for good. The hearing was set for the following week in the town hall. The room was packed. It was the same crowd, the same faces that had watched her humiliation in the square months ago. They were here for the final act, to watch the final public death of Whispering Gables. Thorne was at the front of the room, looking polished and confident. He sat with his lawyer, his expression one of sober civic duty. He was not a vulture, his posture said, but a responsible citizen cleaning up a mess. The board members, men who owed him favors or feared his influence, listened to him with fawning respect. Caleb sat at a simple wooden table, looking tired but resolute. Alara sat beside him. She carried a single, heavy leather satchel. The townspeople whispered as she entered. They saw her swollen belly, her plain, determined face. They saw the woman at the center of the storm. Their judgment was a palpable weight in the room. Thorne's lawyer presented the case. It was simple and brutal. Caleb was bankrupt. His ranch was a hazard. He could not make productive use of the water. Therefore, the rights should be transferred to a more stable and productive member of the community. Namely, Marcus Thorne, whose adjacent property could supposedly make immediate use of it. When he finished, The chairman of the board looked at Caleb. Do you have a response? Caleb stood. I do not, he said, his voice clear and steady. He looked at Alara. But she does. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne smirked. This was perfect. Let the foolish woman speak. Let her seal their fate. Alara stood up. She walked to the front of the room and placed her satchel on the main table. She did not look at the board. She looked at the faces in the crowd. The baker, the smith, the women who had averted their eyes from her in the street. For 5 years, she began, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. This ranch has been the victim of bad luck, or so we thought. She opened her satchel. She did not pull out the ledgers first. She pulled out a large, hand-drawn map of the valley. It was old, from the original survey. She tacked it to the wall. This is the valley as it was laid out 50 years ago. This is the main creek. And this, she said, her finger tracing a faint blue line, is a secondary spring, the Black Creek Spring. It fed the north pasture of the Gables Ranch. She then tacked up a more recent map. This is the valley today. The spring is gone. It dried up, they said. Another piece of bad luck. She finally turned to the ledgers. Mr. Thorne has portrayed himself as a friend to the Gables Ranch, offering advice and brokering deals. But his advice was always to sell, to retreat. His deals always bled just a little bit of life from the ranch. She laid out the evidence piece by piece. The overcharges, the phantom cattle, the pattern of slow, methodical ruin. Her voice was calm, her logic irrefutable. Thorne's lawyer objected, but Alara did not stop. She was not speaking to him. She was speaking to the town. The bad luck was not luck at all. It was a plan. A plan to weaken the ranch until it could be bought for pennies on the dollar. Then she delivered the killing blow. The final piece of the puzzle was the water. The ranch couldn't fail fast enough, so it had to be starved. She walked back to the map. The Black Creek Spring didn't dry up. It was diverted. She pointed to a spot on the map, high in the hills above the north pasture, on land that was now part of Thorne's property. A small dam was built here years ago, just a trickle at first, but enough to slowly salinate the lower pastures, enough to turn fertile land sour, enough to create the bad luck that has plagued this ranch. Thorne, who had been watching with detached amusement, finally lost his composure. The idea that this woman, this asset, had unraveled his meticulous, years-long scheme was too much to bear. He shot to his feet. This is an outrage, an absurdity, he roared, his handsome face twisted with fury. Are we to sit here and listen to the mad ramblings of some purchased woman? The insult, so vile and so public, landed in a dead-silent room. Every person present had heard it, and every person present suddenly saw Marcus Thorne not as a pillar of the community, but as the snake Alara had described. He had confirmed her every accusation with his own venom. Alara did not flinch. She held his gaze. Yes, she said, her voice ringing with cold, clear power. You are. She reached into her satchel and produced one last document. She handed it to the chairman of the board. This is the deed of sale for the property containing the illegal diversion. The sale was finalized 5 years and 2 months ago. The purchaser, she said, turning her gaze back to Thorne, was you. His foreknowledge, his motive, his method. All laid bare. The trap had sprung. Chug. The silence in the town hall was absolute. The chairman of the board, a man who usually wilted under Thorne's influence, looked down at the deed in his hand, then up at Thorne's apoplectic face. For the first time he saw the truth, stark and undeniable. He cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. This board finds the evidence of malicious diversion and commercial sabotage to be compelling. Your petition is denied. The water rights of Whispering Gables are hereby reaffirmed in perpetuity. He then looked to the town sheriff, who had been standing awkwardly at the back of the room. The sheriff, seeing the entire town turn against his patron, made a swift political calculation. He strode forward. "Marcus Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice officious. "You are under arrest for fraud and destruction of property." A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a ripple of stunned, excited murmurs. As the sheriff led a sputtering, defeated Thorne away, a single person began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with applause. It was a roar, and it was not for Caleb. It was for her. Alara stood there, momentarily overwhelmed by the sound. It was the exact opposite of the laughter that had greeted her in the square. That had been the sound of her diminishment. This was the sound of her vindication. Caleb came to her side. He did not say a word. He simply placed a warm, steadying hand on the small of her back. It was an anchor in the storm of emotion. He was not claiming her victory. He was witnessing it. He was guarding it. They walked out of the town hall together, into the afternoon sun. The people who had once scorned her now nodded their heads in respect. They cleared a path for her. She had not been rescued. She had been the rescuer. They rode back to the ranch in the same quiet that had marked their first journey. But this was a different silence. It was not born of distrust, but of a deep, shared understanding. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The burnt skeleton of the hay barn stood as a grim monument to their struggle, but the rest of the ranch, bathed in the soft light, felt peaceful. It felt like a home that had been successfully defended. Caleb went into the house and came back with a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. "What is this?" she asked. "It's a deed," he said. Her heart clenched. She thought of a marriage contract, a new kind of ownership. "It's not for the ranch," he said, as if reading her mind. "It's for the north pasture, the one with the spring." She stared at him, confused. "It's not a gift," he said, his voice earnest and low. "It's yours. You found the water. You saved it. By right, it belongs to you. You don't owe me anything for it." He took a breath, the hardest part still to come. "And I'm not asking you to marry me," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I am asking you to choose to stay, as a partner, as an equal." Alara took the deed. The paper was crisp in her hands. It was land. It was a future. It was a choice freely given. Her vow had been to be beholden to no one. Caleb was not asking her to be beholden. He was asking her to belong. He was offering her a place to plant her own roots, beside his. She looked from the deed in her hands to his honest, weathered face. She saw the man who had bought her debt but not her person. The man who had given her a key. The man who had run into a fire for a boy's life. The man who saw her, truly saw her, for everything she was. "I'll stay," she said. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of a new vow. A vow not of solitude, but of connection. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, a rare and wonderful thing, like the first flower of spring after a long winter. She folded the deed and placed her hand on the porch railing. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. His touch was warm and calloused and real. It was not the touch of an owner, but of a partner, an equal. Together, they watched the last of the sun disappear behind the mountains, leaving the sky full of stars. The gables of the one remaining barn stood dark against the twilight, no longer whispering of exhaustion, but of a quiet, resilient, and hard-won hope. They had a home,